No, absolutely
ketamine
not.
or even glutamate. What about sodium glutamate, which is in
same thing.
Chinese food?
Yeah, but glutamate is endogenous in the sense that it's created by the brain, as indeed is another chemical called DMT.
If you were to take, say, sodium glutamate, would it cross the blood-brain barrier? Could it go into your brain?
Glutamate, I know glutamate is one of the few that does cross the blood-brain barrier. Really? And it's one of the few that do.
So are you saying that you could have a mystical experience of some kind after Chinese food?
Well, there is something which I in fact get called Chinese restaurant syndrome, whereby when I have a Chinese meal, if there's too much sodium glutamate, I feel the blood running through my veins like it's burning. And I notice in recent years I get it less so, and that's the glutamate. I have friends of mine, one particular friend of mine, whose son is profoundly autistic and has epilepsy and various other things. They have noticed that if they cut out the glutamate in his diet, he starts to get better. Because glutamate is crucial. Again, glutamate, there's a wonderful paper written by a guy called Carl Janssen at the Maudsley Hospital. And Carl has been doing experiments on glutamate within the brain and with ketamine. And ketamine and glutamate are virtually identical as chemicals. So effectively, when you shouldn't, but if you happen to take ketamine, it will reproduce a near-death experience, which is what happens to the human brain at the point of death. Everybody's brain during times of extreme stress, like death experience, a car crash or anything, your brain is flooded by this chemical glutamate. What does glutamate do? It slows down your experience of time. How many times have you heard people turn around and say, I was in this car crash and it felt like forever. You know, I spun really slowly.
Yeah, no, I've had a bit of that experience actually.
Right.
And it's true, time is absolutely slowed down, yes.
It is, and this is the glutamate kicking in. And of course, what's more stressful than the final moments of your life? And it is a known neurological effect, the glutamate flood, and it's the glutamate flood that slows down your experience of time. And in doing so, that last second of your life becomes a lifetime. Because relative to you, you never die. You never get to the point of death. Because imagine this, you know, sometimes when you're lying in bed, the alarm goes off.
I mean, I think we ought to sort of announce this as a kind of a fundamental part of your theory here.
It is, yeah. Well, how the theory works, cheating the ferryman. What cheating the ferryman means in principle is, you remember the ancient Greek myth of the idea that when somebody dies, they used to place small coins underneath the tongue of the person called an obolus.
And other cultures over the eyes.
Or over the eyes, which they used to do in Viking times. And the reason that that was done was that the shade, the newly dead person, would find themselves on the banks of the river Styx, and there'd be all this mist, and this ferryman would come through the mist, and I guess the person would go, oh yeah, I've got some money to pay him. And what he'd do is, the person would pay the ferryman, and the ferryman would take the person over the Styx to the other side. And when they got to the other side, they were in the land of the dead. Now, what is interesting about it, if you start reading into the ancient Greek myths, you'll find that that wasn't the end of the story. The ancient Greeks believed there was many rivers of the underworld, and one of the other rivers was called the Lethe, which is called the river of forgetting. And you had to drink of the waters of the river of forgetting, and it would wipe out all your memories of your past life. But if you did that, you were allowed to go back and live your life again. Okay? So the ancient Greeks believed. Now I suggest at the point of death, we cheat the ferryman. We fall out of time, and in falling out of time, we never get to the point of death. We live our lives again in a three-dimensional reproduction of our lives, which I call the Bohmian IMAX, and we can come on to why I call it that later. You live your life again. At the end of that second life, the same thing happens again. You fall out of time in an even smaller bit of time. And what eventually happens is you never, like Zeno's paradox, like the frog jumping from the centre of a pool and every hop is half the size, you never get to the end.
It's like you mentioned in your book, it's like the half-life decay
yes.
of
Although
fissile
I do stand corrected on that, because somebody has pointed out to me that half-life doesn't work that way, that eventually it will go out, but I was only using that as an analogy anyway. A better analogy probably is Zeno's paradox. But the thing is with this, it's whether you can infinitely bisect something, which we won't go into the maths, it's to do with Cantor and infinities and things. But suffice to say, I argue that you have many, many lives, like Phil Connors in the book has many, many days.
In Groundhog Day.
In Groundhog Day. And what happens is, and I deal with the physics of how the brain records this information as well. So there's nothing in my book that's not scientific, and that's the really important point that I need to stress.
Because I think, at the moment, it sounds like a theory, doesn't it? But you've a hypothesis, but you've looked at all the science about reality and about the physical world and how unreal it is, and how even physicists describe it as subject to us observing.
Yeah, the act of observation. There's something called the Copenhagen interpretation, which suggests that the act of observation collapses what's called the wave function. And the idea is that all subatomic particles are actually waves.
Right, Anthony, we're going to have to go for our first break now. If you'd like to text in your questions or comments for Anthony Peake, please do so now to 87778 with the word EDGE and then your text. And we'll see you back here very soon. Just before the break there, we were talking about the way that reality perhaps isn't quite as real and hard as we think. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah. The question of reality and what is physically out there has fascinated scientists since ancient Greek times. It's the idea of what are the ultimate components of solid objects that we see? What are the components of the material world? Now, effectively, we know that they're atoms, but as soon as we were able to get inside the atom, we discovered that 99.99% of an atom is absolutely empty space. So it consists of a very, very solid nucleus and little electrons supposedly whizzing round like a planetary system. But effectively, if you calculate, and I've been told that it's rather similar to the nucleus would be, something the size of a beach ball in the centre of St. Peter's Dome in Rome, and the electrons are little peas whizzing round. So most of it's empty space. But when they start breaking into even the solid bits within an atom, they break down into quarks and various other particles. So clearly reality is made of
Higson they're looking for, aren't they, in CERN?
Yeah, and if they discover these things, it's going to make some very interesting questions. But effectively what they found was that these particles are not even solid, they're waves. And the difficulty then is with a wave is what exactly is a wave? It's not a solid particle, it's something waving in something else. And to cut a long story short, there have been a series of thought experiments done in the 1930s, and one famous one was Schrödinger's cat. But effectively what it came down to was something called the Copenhagen interpretation. And the Copenhagen interpretation of Niels Bohr and the Copenhagen group suggest that in order for the wave to become a particle, a solid point of something...
We're talking about light here, aren't we?
Well, light is an example, but electrons are the same.
Okay.
But let's use light as an example.
Because light is either photons, which are particles...
which are particles.
Or a wave.
Or a wave.
And a wave has to move through some other matter.
Something. And this is why something called the ether was put forward to be an explanation of how that will occur. But what they found was if you fire single photons through twin slits, what you actually find is that they seem to travel as a wave and arrive as a particle. What they discovered, and this is really, really odd, and it still takes a lot to get your head around this, that if they place a monitoring device in either of the two slits and they fire a single photon through, the photon will go through the slit as a solid particle. So the wave function collapses at the slit, becomes a wave function, becomes a particle again. So what they came to the conclusion was that light travels as a wave and arrives as a particle, but what makes it become a particle is the act of measurement. And a measurement is in fact an observation. And the big question is the measuring device consciousness?
This takes us back to that philosophical question. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there, does it make a sound? Yes,
and of course the argument is no, it doesn't, because of course sound waves are processed by the ear, which makes the eardrum vibrate. Sounds do not exist out there. Colour does not exist out there. It's the human brain that processes this.
So the minute you put a microphone in the forest, then it does make a sound.
Yeah, but
you can't. It's like trying to find out if the light in the fridge goes off when you close the door.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
It is.
Because if you're looking, it does go off, but if you're not looking, well, who knows?
Yeah, and in fact, that's the major point of the idea that is reality brought into effect by the act of observation. And indeed, I think it's John Wheeler, has even one of the top particle physicists in the world, has actually suggested that not only an act of observation now brings reality into existence now, but from the first moment of the Big Bang. So in fact, is the reality we perceive real or not? Or is it consciousness that brings it about? And indeed, is it your reality? And is my reality the same as your reality? And if we're all living in the final moments of our lives, we're all living in different realities.
Right, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to read 4 texts out in a go, and you can pick anything you like out of it, okay? Because they're really all good. Hi, I'm Mark Fee. I wish I could have my dreams recorded. It's like a parallel universe. It's like I go to sleep in this world and wake up in another. Okay? This is someone saying, I had a dream which... Oh, I don't think that's... No, I'm not going to read that one. Cy Cornwall, hey guys, I've been waiting for these answers for years. I have had all my life dreams and deja vu, which came true, and thoughts, the same as family. I assume he means that his family has the same kind of thoughts. And then Jim from Larne says, has anyone made a fortune from deja vu?